Hello, I'm Gadi Tau from Tel Aviv. In case this is the first time you're joining me, a short introduction. I'm a historian from Hebrew University. I teach at the Fetterman School of Public Policy. I'm also a columnist for Haaretz, and my PhD is in American history, so I hope that I could stride the American-Israeli divide. And this evening with me is Melanie Philips, the British journalist, broadcaster, Times columnist, and now also author. Good evening, Melanie.
Hello, Gadi.
So first, a word about your book. You now have a novel.
Yes, it's the first time I've written a novel. It's called The Legacy, and it deals with the themes that preoccupy me, which I've put into fictional form. It's mainly about anti-Semitism, the enduring nature of anti-Semitism. It's about fractured national identity of the kind that many diaspora Jews go through, not quite knowing whether they completely belong to the country they're living in, not quite really accepting their Jewish identity. So my fictional hero is someone who is tortured by this kind of fractured identity, and through personal circumstances, the death of his father, he finds himself dragged back into a Jewish community that he swore never to set foot in again. And through this, he comes to understand a little more than he started out, that you can't avoid the pull of history, the pull of your own history, that your identity is something that you can't run away from very easily. And that in the course of this discovery, he discovers certain things about himself, and that really all his assumptions are thrown up in the air. And it's a novel which has a broad canvas. It is set in modern-day Britain, modern-day Israel, and a little bit in America, and also Holocaust Poland and medieval Britain. So you can see it's quite a large canvas I've set myself.
So a lot of research.
A great deal of research. It was good fun to do. From that point of view, I learned a lot. And a bit of an adventure for me to turn myself into a novelist. I wasn't sure whether it would actually work. But I've been tremendously encouraged by the reaction of readers who have gone on to Amazon in quite large number and have written little reviews in which they have said something that has given me more pleasure, more or less, than anything that I've had before, in any reaction I've had before, which is to say that they couldn't put it down. They kept turning the page. And, you know, I spent much of my professional life trying to rescue Western civilization. Not much chance of that. And so it's given me inordinate pleasure that people have been able to say to me that
you've taken a modern task.
Unable to stop reading. Yes, indeed.
Was it a journey of discovery for you, or did you know what your message was beforehand? Were you getting at something you already knew?
Yeah, I was getting at something I already knew. What I didn't expect, although I read about this phenomenon, was that the characters, after a certain stage in the writing of a novel, the characters sort of take over, and you're not quite sure where they're going to go, and they take you in strange places. And having had such difficulty in bringing this thing to creation in the first place, I then found these characters are kind of taken up residence in my head, and I sort of carry them with me all the time. It's really quite a freaky experience.
Is it over when you finish writing?
No, because I'm still sort of in the story, really. But it's enough time has now elapsed to move on and think of the next one.
You've written a memoir before. I want to show this on screen. It's called Guardian Angel: My Journey from Leftism to Sanity. In a conversation we had previously, I understood it's not incidental that you said from left to sanity, not from left to right. What's your objection to
Yes,
right?
I mean, I've been called right-wing as soon as I, in the mid to late 80s, started to challenge the orthodoxies of the left when I wrote for the Guardian newspaper. I wrote for it for about 20 years. And as soon as I challenged the orthodoxies of the left, virtually overnight, literally overnight, in fact, I became I was called right-wing. And I just believe that these labels, left and right, are pretty meaningless. I mean, left means something because, you know, there is a leftist ideology which you can identify. Right, in the words of the left, really means nothing more than an insult. It means you are not one of us, you're opposed to us, you're really a bad person. because we stand for moral virtue and all good things, and so you must be bad. So I prefer to think of myself as having made a journey from fantasists to realists. And that's how I think of it. And I haven't really changed my views. I still stand for the same things that I always did when I started working for The Guardian.
So you just changed your views about how to implement the same values, or?
What changed? No, I mean, I stood then and I stand now for things like truth against lies and resistance to tyranny and telling the truth to power, standing up for the vulnerable, making a better world. All those things I still hold to. But what changed, and it changed everything for me very dramatically, was that I came to believe that the people that I thought were marching with me behind those banners actually were on the other side. They actually stood for racism, even though they tell us the whole time they are anti-racists. I believe they were actually racists. A lot of them were anti-Semites. And they stood for lies against truth, and they stood for the exploitation of the vulnerable, and they stood for the manipulation of evidence, and they stood for authoritarianism and illiberalism. They were not liberals, and I thought of myself in the British sense, as a classical liberal, somebody who believes in truth, in progress, in maximizing
personal liberty.
the good. Personal liberty constrained by law and constrained by fetters on our own appetites. And that's the point about the left. They have embraced liberty without constraints on our own personal appetite. So they put themselves first. It's all about the I society rather than the we society. And in that, there is an absolute symmetry between them and the economic liberals or libertarians of what's called the right, who believe in absolute freedom in the market. They believe in the free market. They believe the free market is the panacea for everything. And between those two sides, basically coming at it from the social, one from the economic perspective, but basically all about me, they dissolve community, they dissolve conscience, and they dissolve rationality itself.
But you haven't said nationalism in all this description. And I think at least the right in most of Europe and probably in America would say, hold on, wait a minute, we are patriots, and that's the big difference.
Well, yes, indeed. And that is indeed an enormous difference. The point about patriotism is that it is based on an idea of the nation state. And without the nation state, I firmly believe, you can't have democracy, and you can't have a culture which expresses its own historic traditions and values and is free to do so through the democratically elected representatives who put into place laws based on that culture. And only through a nation in its own state, can a people defend that culture against invasion. You know, if Britain hadn't been a nation that really understood what it was defending in 1940, it would not have stood alone against Hitler, and I wouldn't be here to tell the tale today. So the idea that the nation is a source of our liberties is something that the left has completely turned on its head, and it has pretended to itself that the nation is instead the source of everything that's bad in the world. So they tell themselves this fiction that without the nation, there would be no war, there would be no prejudice. And this is based on this idea that there can be no difference between anything, and there can be no hierarchy between anything. So we in the West cannot tell ourselves or anybody else that a liberal society, that Western society, is actually better than non-Western societies, because the left in the West tells itself that that is racist. It is racist to have any kind of hierarchy. As a result, you can't defend the West. And what I've written about for the last 20 years and why I parted company with the left in Britain to this extent was that I came to believe very strongly that all the things I was writing about in turn, first of all, the collapse of the British education system, then the willed collapse of the traditional married nuclear family, then the collapse of the idea of national values in favor of multiculturalism, on and on and on. And I came to realize that these things were not random and separate. They were actually all linked. And they were part of a whole way of thinking which basically said that the values of the West are bad and evil and exploitative and capitalist and colonialist and have to be overturned, and overturned from within. So we subvert from within, we turn them inside out. And that the nation which gives expression to those values is itself fundamentally illegitimate because it stands for all these things and it produces division in the world. And so the way to the sunlit uplands of the perfect society in the world is through transnational institutions and transnational
such as the
laws.
European Union, which the
such
Brits
as the European Union, such as
have,
the United Nations, such as international human rights law, which in my view is international anti-human rights law, but that's another rather complicated story.
Let me tell you a part of the story from a perspective you probably know pretty well, but for the sake of argument, the Israeli perspective, because Israel has become the paradigm of the nation state. For a long time, if you wanted to argue about how horrible nationalism is, here is Israel. They've been the victims of the Nazis, and now they are now they're new Nazis, and they are victimizing the Palestinians. This has been a breathtaking for us, because when I was growing up, 60s, early 70s, European idealists would come to volunteer in kibbutzim in Israel, yes. And we were the paradigm of rising from the ashes, self-determination, self-reliance, and everything that was supposed to be good about the nation. And then, breathtakingly, within something like 15 years. Perhaps 20 years, in the mid-80s, we were suddenly Goliath. The Palestinians were David, and we were the evil, the epitome of the evil of nationalism. So, is this something that has to do with that happened to Israel, or is that something to do with that happened to the West?
Well, I believe it's all basically the same story, just of different departments. I mean, it took me quite some time, many years in fact, to realize that what I was writing about from the point of view of the West, and what I just described, the kind of onslaught on the values of the West, was actually symbiotically connected to what I came in latter years to write about, which was the onslaught on Israel and the eruption of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And I've come to the conclusion over some time that these are connected in a number of different ways. The first way is pretty obvious, that the Western left bought into a whole colonialist capitalist narrative into which Israel fitted, because under that narrative, the developing world cannot ever be held responsible for what it does, because it is intrinsically the victim of the West. The West cannot ever be the victim of the developing world because it has exploited the developing world. And so, cut a long story short, into that mindset marched an extremely sophisticated, well-funded, well-planned program of propaganda to twist and turn the Western mind to believe that instead of the Arab world waging, as it had done for decades, a war of extermination against the Jewish homeland in Israel, suddenly that became the indigenous Palestinians being the victims of Israeli colonialism. And so that's pretty obvious. We can all see that that is what happened, and we can all understand that fitted into the anti-colonialist Western leftist perspective. But I believe there was something rather deeper that connected the onslaught on the West with the onslaught on Israel. And it has two related elements. The onslaught on the West basically replaced biblical-based morality by ideologies, secular ideologies, which sought to take God out of the picture completely and put man in his place. And these ideologies were all basically supposedly designed to perfect the world. So, for example, multiculturalism would remove prejudice from the human heart. Transnationalism would remove war from the face of the globe. Egalitarianism would remove all prejudice against people on the basis of any kind of hierarchy of difference, and so on and so on. Now, every single one of these ideologies had at its root an attack on a biblical precept. People in the West think of that as being an attack on Christianity, which indeed it was. But of course, at the heart of Christianity is the Hebrew Bible. Without the Hebrew Bible, there is no Christian morality. It is basically Jewish morality. Jesus was a Jew. He preached Jewish ethics. And so what these ideologies all had in common was an onslaught on basically Jewish values. And the third aspect of all this was that because this was a secular onslaught on the Christian West, the Christian and Jewish West, this was founded on the absolutely implacable belief in the West among progressively minded, intellectually minded individuals that everything that's bad is in a box marked religion and everything that's good is in a box marked secularism. So they think that secularism kind of invented for itself good things that we all hold dear: personal freedom, justice and the rule of law, a sense of compassion, putting others first, standing up for the vulnerable, for the weak and for the dispossessed, against the mighty, a resistance to tyranny, and so on. And indeed, reason itself and science. All these things come from secularism. Religion, we're told, stands against all these things. It's obscurantist. It's believed in only by people who are stupid, and they're superstitious, and they are irrational, and they're anti-science, and they're anti-reason, and they are anti-freedom because they're authoritarian and want to tell us all how to live. Now, what people like that don't realize and really will not accept is that all those good things in the secularist box come from the Hebrew Bible. We wouldn't have in the West a society that was based on compassion and justice and the rule of law and all those good things, were it not for the Hebrew Bible, which gave us the moral codes to constrain ourselves to do all those things. And so they've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. To put it mildly, far from creating a kind of man-centered utopia in which we've eradicated prejudice and tyranny and all the rest of it, we have what I would call, and others have called, cultural totalitarianism, in which, just like the medieval Catholic Church, just like the French Revolutionary Terror, just like Soviet communism, we have a system now which is supposedly liberal, which is totally illiberal, in which anyone who dissents from the governing orthodoxies of the left is not only considered wrong, but considered evil and must be silenced and stopped. And so they have overturned the cardinal precepts of the Hebrew Bible, which they don't realize is what has given them over centuries a culture and a tradition and a set of values which they prize, but not understanding where it's come from. They are, to mix my metaphor, currently sawing off the branch on which they sit. And as a result, it's not surprising, given that this is fundamentally an onslaught on the Hebrew Bible and on Jewish moral codes, it's not surprising that in their sights is the state of Israel, and the Jewish people, the great resurgence of anti-Semitism. And as you've just said, the state of Israel is the paradigm nation state, which believes in a set of values and whose people love and admire and respect and cherish those values and that tradition and the bonds of history that tie modern Israelis to generations going in the past, that they're prepared to fight and die for them. That's something that the West can't understand, and it's in the way of the universalizing ideologies which stand against everything that Israel and the Jewish people stand for.
Let me point out also what I think is a psychological thing going on, because Europe has guilt feelings about its treatment of the Jews, and ironically, it is now cleansing its own conscience by blaming the Jews,
Absolutely.
which is a strange thing, to do. And this is going on basically, or mostly, I think, on the left, because we have been, after the great traumas of the recent century, the 20th century, we were accustomed first to see anti-Semitism as a right-wing phenomenon. And now it's stronger on the left. I mean, look at the whole scene. I mean, I don't have to say that to someone with an eye on the United Kingdom, where an anti-Semite for the first time was almost could have gotten elected to the prime ministership in England, but it's the same in France. And look now at America, where at the far left of the Democratic Party, anti-Semitism is being excused, where like Representative Ilhan Omar from Minnesota, Rashida Tlaib, and others are explicit anti-Semites, and this is being excused by mainstream candidates. How has it happened that anti-Semitism became a left-wing phenomenon?
It always was. It always was. Marx himself was a profound anti-Semite. Marx, who was born ethnically a Jew, converted to Christianity, I think he was baptized, and he wrote an entire pamphlet or book about how the perfect society would be free of any Jew, that the Jew was rapacious and capitalist and so on. So this idea that the Jew is at the very center of the capitalist web, which has spread its tentacles over the world to inflict misery upon people. That is fundamental to the left and always was. And so and if you go back further, I mean, it's not what one thinks of as the left, but nevertheless, the French Revolution basically was the left. They were profoundly anti-Jew.
But there still is a distinction. There still is a distinction because, first of all, Jews have been attracted to those ideologies because they thought of them as universalist. So the
Jews,
right,
only a certain sort of Jew.
Mm-hmm.
The Jews who were attracted to those ideologies, just like today, are the Jews who want to basically deny or are hostile to or are embarrassed by the Jewish part of their identity. They don't want it. And those Jews are, as you say, some of the most enthusiastic supporters of these ideologies. But what you say is absolutely correct, that there is this tremendous guilt complex. It really is a complex in the West, that by creating the Israelis as Hitler, as Nazis, they can avoid blame retrospectively in their minds, because if the Israelis are Nazis, well, so everyone can be a Nazi. And so, you know, we did what we connived at in the West, in Europe, wasn't so bad after all. There's all that going on. But there's something else that I find and I think has happened, which is this. I think the Holocaust spawned many pathologies. And one of the pathologies it spawned was this belief that, well, there are many pathologies that it spawned, but what I'm getting at is that I think that in the Holocaust lies the seeds of victim culture. And this is how it works. We're in a kind of auction in the West in victim culture. We have groups competing to be the biggest victim. Now, isn't that a strange thing? Intersectionality and all that madness. Now, isn't it a strange thing when you think about it? Why would anyone want to be a victim? So the answer is very obvious. If you're a victim, you can pose as someone who is morally pure because you're a victim. So you can't be held responsible for what you've done, if you've done bad things, because you can't be held responsible because you're not really able to be responsible because you're the victim. That's how it works. So that's why people are so keen to claim victim status. Now, why do they think this? That if you're a victim, you can get away with it? And the answer, I would suggest, is that, and this is why they are so desperate to say that the Holocaust has been overstated, that Jews shelter behind the Holocaust all the time. They pretend that the Holocaust will prevent, they use the Holocaust as the kind of shield to protect Israel from being accountable for its own terrible deeds. Why do they say this? because they do believe that with the Holocaust, the Jews got away with it. I'll never forget somebody I once had a conversation with, whom I previously held in high regard in Britain. He was a liberal journalist, a liberal in the best sense, I thought. And he said to me, you know, you got this completely wrong, this whole thing about Israel and anti-Semitism. It's not anti-Semitism. And I said, this was many years ago, so before Corbyn, well before Corbyn became leader of the party. And I said, what do you mean it's not anti-Semitism? And he said, well, you've got to understand that it's such a relief that we don't have to worry about the Jews anymore. Now, to put it mildly, that was an ambiguous thing to say. And I said, what do you mean you don't have to worry about the Jews anymore? And he said, well, you don't understand that for all those years, we felt we couldn't criticize the Jews because we would have the Holocaust thrown at us. And now we can. And I said to him, what are you telling me? That because now you think that the Israelis are Nazis, it's open season on the Jews again? And he said, well, there's no need to put it like that. But that's exactly what he meant. In other words, when the Holocaust was discovered, when the camps were finally discovered, the West, Europe recoiled in horror. This is what we've done. And anti-Semitism went underground immediately. It became a thing that was confined to people on literally the lunatic fringe of society, treated with condign disapproval. Scroll forward many years, for many reasons that we can go into this tonight or today or another time, Israel became the hated neo-Nazi thing that it became. And suddenly they were able again to be horrible about the Jews. And why they wanted to do that, and the resentment they have about the use of the Holocaust by the Jewish people, is that they think that the Jewish people have used the Holocaust to get away with the stuff that they know the Jews are actually guilty of. What are they actually guilty of? Well, all the things that Jews are guilty of. Running the world in their interests, being a conspiracy against everything that's good, just wanting power. In other words, victim culture is based on profound anti-Semitism. They want these benefits for themselves. They want to get away with it. And in order to get away with it, they have to pretend that the people who are the true victims of true bigotry, the Jewish people, aren't that at all. That's how it works. And so these are multiple pathologies from the Holocaust.
From the point of view of Zionism, the culture of victimhood is anathema. And I'll tell you why. Because I think that Zionism's greatest achievement was to overcome the tendency, which Jews did have, to define their identity around the horrors done to them. And Zionism, we just experienced the Holocaust Memorial Day here, and there was great criticism in Israel of Ben Gurion and the establishment for ignoring or downplaying the Holocaust. But what Zionism did in a very deep sense is it told Jews that it would take responsibility for the lives of Jews. And I think at the basis of Zionist moral outlook was the idea that it's immoral not to have power, that you need to have power in order to do good in the world. And if you renounce power and just decide to be a victim, you may feel pure, but you can't do good.
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct. And of course, to the anti-Semite, to the anti-Semitic West, Israel has power. It has military power. It actually uses that power to kill people. And so the fact that it only ever does so uniquely in the world, its army only ever goes to war in its own defense, that's ignored completely. And the victimization of Israelis, the hundreds of rockets coming over from Gaza, being fired from Gaza in order to kill civilians in Israel's south, is ignored completely. And instead, people say, look, these Jews, they have power, they're killing people. And so the anti-Semitic canard from centuries back, that the Jews have power, conceived at a time when the Jews were completely powerless, has now been shown in all its awful glory to the anti-Semitic West. Look, Israel has power. This is what we've always feared, the Jews with power. And so it feeds into the conspiracy theory of anti-Semites, I'm afraid. But as you say, never again means that the Jews will always now have the means to defend themselves, because they cannot ever rely on anyone else.
You know, a lot of the views you criticize are epitomized in Israeli discourse by Professor Ze'ev Sternhal, a historian and a specialist on French fascism, in fact.
Yes, I read his books.
But one of the things, I have many arguments, polemics against his views, but one of the things he said, and I think it was on the occasion of receiving the Prize of Israel, was that he had seen the Nazis shoot his parents in the back of the head when he was 10 years old. And he said, at that moment, I swore that I will die with a gun in my hand. And now he's a pacifist and all that, but there is still a core of this Zionist idea that a gun in your hand is not immoral. It's to the contrary, it is immoral to renounce power. Now, let me ask you on the side of your work practice. You write about politics, and you're renowned for speaking your mind unabashedly. What do you find is effective against this kind of mindset that you criticize here?
Well, one of the many frustrations of my life is that I'm not often given the chance to argue with the people who oppose me, because they won't give me platforms. They won't invite me to speak to them. And they won't engage in argument in terms of what I write. They simply shelter behind insult. What is effective is to use their tactics against them. They use tactics of sort of verbal warfare against us, or against me, and against the Jewish people, against Israel, in that they go on to the attack the whole time. They accuse, they accuse, they accuse. And the weapons they use are lies. Now, our reaction, the Jewish people trying to defend Israel, is one of a defensive posture. And that is fatal. It is absolutely fatal. Because we're basically always saying to them, why are you being so awful about us? We're the victims here. You know, we've got these rockets coming over from Gaza. Why are you telling us that we are the people who are aggressive? You can see that we're not. Or we say to them, look at the wonderful things we're doing in Israel. We are delivering aid to countries which are suffering from terrible stuff that's going on. We are developing things to benefit humanity, our scientific and our medical advances. Look at what we're doing in Israel. We have coexistence. We have Palestinian Arab doctors and nurses and jurists and police officers and army soldiers. Why are you being horrible to us? Stop it. Hopeless. As soon as you are defensive, you are basically entering their territory. Their territory is obnoxious and wrong and bad and evil. We should not be on their territory. As soon as you go on their territory, you've lost. Whatever truths you bring forward, however persuasive your account, you've lost. So we have to be on the aggressive. We have to basically be saying, without being prompted, we have to be saying to and of them, you are fascists. You are racists, you are liars, you are incompetent scholars, you are stupid, you are ridiculous. And our side has to be basing all this on truth. But we don't do that because we're not aggressive. And consequently, we lose the battle before we even started. So if we were to do that collectively, I think it would change the atmosphere overnight, because immediately, they would be on the defensive. They would be having to justify what they're saying, in which case you've got them. Whereas at the moment, they've got us. And that's how it is year in, year out. It's extremely frustrating because our side, as I say, decent people don't normally go on to the aggressive. They don't take aggressive postures. Why should they? They're nice people. They want to live in peace and harmony with everybody else. They don't understand that if one is in this kind of ideological, cultural, political battleground, it really is a battleground. And the enemy has always regarded it as a battleground and has equipped itself accordingly. And we've been taken to the cleaners.
Last thing, I know prophecy from the destruction of the Second Temple has been given to fools, but also to journalists. So let's try. And I wanted to ask you if you think that the resurgence of nationalism, which we saw before the coronavirus plague began, would that act in Israel's favor, or would it be, as some on the left predict, a resurgence of right-wing anti-Semitism?
They really do crease me up, these people who argue this. And many, if not most, of the Jewish community in Britain argues precisely that. They were all against Brexit because they thought that if Britain became again an independent nation, then we'd have the resurgence of anti-Semitism. And if the European Union collapses, they're going to get anti-Semitism in Europe. Hello? I mean, under the European Union, we have pandemic, if I can use that phrase, anti-Semitism in Europe. And under the EU's membership, Britain developed Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party with this eruption of appalling anti-Semitism. So what are they talking about? There is this tremendous fear of the nation among many, many Jews, as well as others on the left. The Jews, not just on the left, in Britain, they can be conservatively minded Jews, and they still believe this, on the basis that Hitler was a nationalist. Well, excuse me? I mean, okay, you can say, nationalism played a significant role in German Nazism, but Hitler was an imperialist. He wanted to invade other people's countries. If Britain hadn't been a proud, patriotic nation, it would never have stood up against him. So in my view, the nation is the only protection against this kind of thing. And in my view also, anti-Semitism it's always been with us. It's always going to be with us. We can never get rid of it. But the most we can ever hope to do is to keep it at a manageable level, keep it down. Now, my view is that anti-Semitism roars out of control when a society feels itself going down, when its people feel powerless, that they feel they can't affect for the better their collective lives. They feel that they're losing their culture. They feel they're losing their connection to anything. And then they turn on the weakest and the most vulnerable, who are always the Jews, who they simultaneously consider the most powerful. Paradox. So in my view, if Britain becomes a strong nation again, if it ever finally leaves the terrible embrace of the European Union, then the anti-Semitism is going to potentially get better. And as far as Israel is concerned, the resurgence of national identity, and I would say healthy national identity, that is patriotism, love of country, not designed on anyone else's country, that will help Israel, because then, this idea, which is the orthodoxy, that the nation is a bad thing, the ethnic nation is an absolute abomination. And so Israel, an ethnic nation, is a terrible abomination. That will fade, because everybody will be basically saying, we've got to be a nation ourselves. So I think that would help Israel. It wouldn't be the ultimate panacea, but it would certainly help.
Melanie Philips, it was a pleasure, and I hope we can do it again. Thank you so much.
I hope so. Thank you for the pleasure and privilege of talking to you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.